At first light, Staff Sergeant Corey Reyes moved along Arlington's eastern ceremonial lane, with his boots clicking in perfect rhythm, each strike on stone precise enough to sound like a metronome for memory, while mist lay low between white headstones and the marble, caught the new sun in pale gold, and the crowd stood hushed as if they had stepped inside a cathedral without walls. He was 6'2" in dress blues cut to exacting standard, shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes fixed on a point beyond distraction. Every crease on his coat looked sharp enough to cut glass. His brass shone clean. His white gloves were pristine. The kepi sat at a precise angle that had been checked, adjusted, and checked again before dawn. Even from the 20 yards away, tourists saw the discipline before they understood the man. A little boy in a red windbreaker stopped whispering and gripped his father's sleeve with both hands, then looked up with the solemn confusion children wear when they sense gravity before they can name it. Corey completed the line, halted on the mark, turned with clean mechanical grace, and began again. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. The pattern was old, older than anyone in that morning crowd, older than their arguments and opinions and schedules. It had survived wars, weather, and years when the nation had fractured itself in loud public ways, and still on that lane, rhythm held. There was no theater in it, no flourish. Ceremony, at its highest form, was not performance, it was fidelity. Corey knew that in his bones, and he gave it back to the ground in measured silence. The eastern side of the cemetery carried a different sound from the plaza near the tomb, softer and farther from the concentration of visitors, but no less sacred for distance. Sparrows moved through trimmed hedges. A maintenance cart hummed somewhere well beyond the lane, and then disappeared behind low trees. Dew clung to clipped grass around rows of markers that rose in white lines over the slope, each name or unknown inscription facing the morning, with the same stillness as the sentinel in blue. The flag in the distance moved once, lightly, and then settled again. A retired infantryman stood near the rope line in a tan jacket with old unit patches sewn cleanly on the sleeves. His hands were large and worn, fingertips thickened by decades of labor, and on his lapel sat a pin no bigger than a fingernail. Crossed rifles in worn metal. Beside him, an elderly woman in a navy coat held his elbow with both hands as Corey passed and turned. Neither spoke for several cycles. Their silence was not uncertainty. It was respect shaped by years. When the woman finally did speak, her voice stayed low, almost prayerful. "He doesn't miss a beat." The veteran nodded once. "He can't." A group of high school students arrived with a teacher carrying a folder and attendance sheet, chatter trailing them in thin threads until they reached the lane, and saw Corey in motion. One by one, conversations dropped away. 2 students lowered their phones without being told. A girl with a braided ponytail tucked her hands into her jacket sleeves and watched the turn with narrowed focus, as if trying to map the geometry in her head. The teacher leaned close to her group and spoke quietly. "Remember where you are." They did. Their posture changed. Their eyes stayed up. A mother guided a wheelchair along the paved edge and stopped by a Marine's headstone 2 rows over, where fresh flowers had been set in a small bronze vase. The child in the chair wore a pale blue cardigan and held a folded photo in both hands, careful not to bend the corners. She was young enough that her feet did not reach the chair's footrests fully, toes hovering above them by an inch, but she held herself with a steadiness that seemed borrowed from the place itself. Corey did not look toward her. His bearing remained fixed. Yet his awareness tracked every person in his arc without visible shift. A trained sweep of detail and distance that read, "the living while honoring the dead." Visitors who had expected a static monument found instead a living instrument of discipline. Corey's march was exact, but exactness did not mean coldness. Under the controlled exterior, he carried names and dates like a second set of dog tags. 2 deployments in Afghanistan had taught him to identify danger by texture and timing, to read roads and rooftops and crowds with peripheral precision. A later tour in Syria had taught him the cost of delayed decisions and the burden of necessary ones. The thin scar along his left jaw, nearly hidden unless sunlight caught it from the side, was a narrow, bright line where shrapnel had once rewritten the shape of his face without touching his resolve. The morning progressed by measured degrees. By 7:20, the mist had begun to lift from the lower rows, and sunlight warmed the tops of the markers, while shadows still pooled at their bases. Corey's pace remained unchanged. He had learned long ago that duty was rarely a single grand gesture. It was accumulation, one step correctly placed, one turn executed without drift, one breath under control, repeated until repetition became devotion. To the crowd, he looked carved from stone, but inside him every instinct remained awake, cataloging movement, spacing, posture, and tone with the quiet vigilance of a man forged in places where hesitation could cost a life. He had not come to this lane for spectacle or praise. He had come because of Specialist Aaron Pike, whose laugh once carried across a chow hall in Kandahar after he dropped an entire tray and announced to a room of exhausted soldiers, "If I ever cook, remind me war crimes are illegal." Even now the line lived in Corey's memory with unbearable clarity. The humor warm and human in a year defined by dust and hard edges. Pike had been the one who checked everyone's gear twice before patrol, the one who traded his dessert for instant coffee, the one who wrote letters home for a teammate with a broken wrist. En route there, an IED took him in a flash of force and silence. The convoy survived. Corey did not leave that road unchanged. When he later chose the old guard, some people assumed ceremony had replaced combat. Corey knew better, and so did every soldier who had ever stood this duty with full understanding. The work demanded a different weapon system, perfect composure, relentless precision, and the moral endurance to stand for men and women whose names might never be known, but whose sacrifice held up the freedoms moving through every ordinary American morning. At Arlington, the nation's memory was not abstract. It was measured in rows, dates, and folded flags. It was measured in parents who came alone, in spouses who returned with grandchildren, in wheelchairs stopped by polished marble. While children asked quiet questions, adults answered with wet eyes and steady voices. A pair of middle-aged brothers in ball caps removed them as Corey approached. One held his hat against his chest and stared at the headstones in long lines over the hill. "My uncle's up there," he murmured. The other replied without looking away from Corey's march, "Then he's in good hands." They fell silent as Corey halted, turned, and resumed with the same unbroken cadence. Nearby, a young couple with an infant in a stroller stepped aside to clear the path, the father lifting the stroller wheels over a seam in the pavement so it would not rattle during the pause. Nobody instructed them. The place taught them. By 7:31, more visitors had gathered near the lane, but the mood held its disciplined quiet. The crowd was diverse in age, accent, and background. A nurse in scrubs under a raincoat who had come after a night shift, a college student with a backpack and veteran grandfather, a postal worker still wearing his route shoes, a father in construction boots, 2 women in matching memorial shirts printed with a last name and years of service. In another setting, they would have remained strangers, passing one another without notice. Here they stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by a common stillness and by the understanding that no one was entitled to this ground without reverence. Corey's dress blue coat sat smooth across his back, even as his shoulders worked under controlled repetition. His ribbons were aligned like a ruler's edge, each color earned, not decorative. The Tomb Guard identification badge, small but unmistakable to those who knew, rested above his chest pocket as a symbol of standards that admitted no shortcuts. The black soles of his shoes landed with quiet force and lifted with perfect economy. Nothing in his movement was wasted. Nothing was casual. He was not an ornament of history. He was a living vow in motion, one soldier carrying forward a legacy built by generations who had answered when called and in too many cases never returned. As the sun climbed, the marble brightened and the mist thinned into threads over the grass. Corey maintained the cadence. The crowd watched in reverent silence. Across Arlington's rolling hills, white markers stood in disciplined rows like a formation that never broke. And in that morning hush, boots on stone, breath controlled, eyes forward, the sacred held, steady and unyielding, under the guardianship of a man who understood exactly what it cost. The sacred held for one breath more, and then a truck horn ripped across the lane like a flare gun in a chapel. Heads turned in one sharp motion. A lifted black pickup with oversized tires bounced over a low-service curb near the restricted edge by Section 60, chrome grille flashing in the sun, music pounding from open doors hard enough to shake the nearby signpost that clearly read, "Authorized vehicles only." The driver wore a pro jersey stretched across broad shoulders and mirrored sunglasses even in morning haze. He killed the horn, revved once for show, and shouted through a grin, "Move, parade boy, you're blocking the party." The words hit the hillside and seemed to stain it. A portable grill clanged onto the grass. One of his friends hauled a cooler from the truck bed and snapped it open, bright aluminum cans visible against melting ice, while another lifted a phone on a stabilizer and narrated into the lens with the breathless confidence of a man who had never been told no in a place that mattered. Brent Halverson stepped down with theatrical swagger, championship ring glittering on his right hand, and slapped the tailgate as if he were claiming a parking lot outside a stadium. He did not look at the headstones first. He looked at his own reflection in the truck window, then at his follower count. The crowd froze, and the silence turned from reverence to shock. The retired infantryman's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out at his temples. The high school teacher moved instinctively in front of two students, not from fear of violence, but from a reflex older than language, the reflex to shield younger eyes from disrespect. The mother at the Marine's grave gripped the wheelchair handles, knuckles pale, while her daughter clutched the folded photo tighter against her cardigan and stared at the truck like it had driven through a church altar. Two elderly women in memorial shirts looked at one another with disbelief, then back at Corey, waiting for the standard they trusted to answer what they were seeing. Brent's entourage kept unloading. A collapsible table snapped open. A bag of charcoal thudded to the turf. Someone laughed when a can slipped, fizzed and rolled until it tapped a bronze marker and came to rest there, as obscene as graffiti on marble. One young man in a foam finger pointed toward Corey and said, "Get him in frame. This will go viral." The music pulsed again, fight song brass and drumline cadence, mocking the measured solemnity that had ruled this ground seconds earlier. Brent raised both hands to his camera and spun, presenting the rows of white stones behind him as if they were a backdrop rented for content. Corey did not move from his line. His face remained a mask of discipline, eyes level, posture exact. To the untrained eye, he looked decorative, ceremonial, an artifact standing still while louder men took over. What they could not see was the shift inside him, fast and precise, as a bolt cycling in a chamber. Distance, 42 yards from a truck front bumper to Memorial Path. Crowd density, high near rope line, vulnerable cluster, including elderly visitors, and a child in a wheelchair at 11 o'clock. Hazards, open flame equipment, open containers, moving vehicle, agitated group, recording devices amplifying provocation. He cataloged each factor without a single visible change in breathing. What Brent Halverson did not know was that the soldier he had called Parade Boy had spent 3 deployments reading threat patterns in marketplaces and road choke points where one wrong interpretation meant body bags. He did not know Corey Reyes could map escalation windows almost by instinct, could identify the one loud actor in a group of 10 and the one quiet person likely to panic, could hold a line under taunts without giving his pulse away. He did not know that Corey wore the Tomb Guard badge, not as ornament but as covenant, and that every marker on that hillside, named and unknown, was inside the perimeter of Corey's duty the moment he saw the violation. "Yo, crank it up," Brent yelled, pointing at the speaker. "We're doing this right. Arlington edition." He turned back toward Corey with a smirk sharpened by entitlement. "You hear me, toy soldier? We paid to travel. We're not leaving because you like quiet." A hiss moved through the bystanders, low and furious. "That's a federal cemetery," one tourist whispered, voice trembling with anger. "Somebody stop this," another murmured. A veteran in a ball cap took one step forward and then checked himself, eyes cutting to Corey, honoring the chain of responsibility even while outrage burned through him. The retired infantryman slipped a phone from his pocket and typed with deliberate speed, not filming, not grandstanding, but sending a brief message to a number he still kept from years in uniform. His thumb hovered, then hit send. Corey's gaze tracked Brent's hands, then the truck, then the grill. He registered the keys still in the ignition. He registered one entourage member already drifting toward the driver's door, hyped by noise and performance. The mist had fully lifted now, and the morning heat began to rise from stone and clipped grass, carrying diesel exhaust into the scent of cut earth and fresh flowers. The contrast made the violation even more profane. Polished marble and beer foam, folded flags and tailgate chants, names carved in permanence, and a man chasing temporary attention, as if volume could outrank sacrifice. The little girl by her father's grave did not cry. She looked from Corey to Brent and back again, searching for the order adults promise children the world contains. Her mother knelt beside her chair and whispered, "Stay with me, baby." The girl nodded once, still holding the photo, and that tiny act of composure struck Corey harder than any insult. Beneath his stillness, every muscle coiled. Protocol stayed intact by intention, not by passivity. He would hold it until the line moved from insult to immediate danger, and not 1 second longer. Brent grabbed a lighter, flicked it twice, and grinned at his camera. "Historic tailgate, baby! Nobody's stopping this." Behind him, one of his friends shouted, "Legend!" and panned the phone across rows of graves as if collecting trophies. Brent threw a glance at Corey again and barked, louder this time, "You're a prop in a costume. Stay in your lane." Corey stayed in his lane. He stayed because discipline was strength under command, and command was duty under law. Yet inside that disciplined frame, he had already selected the breach point if required, already calculated the verbal command sequence, already marked the quickest route to prevent vehicle movement toward the memorial path where families stood exposed. He felt Aaron Pike's absence like a hand on his shoulder, not as ghost story, but as memory and mandate, the same mandate that had brought him to this ground. Guard the fallen, guard the living who came to mourn them, and never surrender sacred space to ego. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. The camera angle widened in the mind's eye the way it did when tension rose, pulling back just enough to show all the fault lines at once. Arlington's slopes rolled outward in disciplined white geometry, rows upon rows of markers set with a precision that turned grief into order without ever diminishing its pain. Morning had shifted toward full light, humidity building over Virginia grass. The air carried 3 layers at war with one another: clipped earth, warm metal, and propane. Across that collision stood Corey Reyes in dress blues, so exact they looked engineered, coat seams straight, brass mirrored, ribbons aligned with ruler certainty, white gloves unmarked by the disorder erupting 10 yards away. Visitors became a living ledger of what this place represented. A postal worker, still in root shoes, removed his cap and held it against his chest. 2 high school boys who had arrived joking now stood silent, phones down at their sides, confronted by a lesson no classroom could stage. An elderly couple with veteran pins remained arm in arm, both staring at the can near the bronze marker, with the same expression, as if someone had spoken loudly over a eulogy. The nurse in scrubs near the rope line stepped closer to the mother and daughter by the Marine grave, not touching, simply placing herself within reach in case support was needed. Small acts, civilian discipline. The crowd was learning in real time what sacred ground demanded. Corey read them all in peripheral slices while holding his bearing. External stillness concealed a full tactical map. He tracked who might intervene emotionally, who might stumble if pushed, who was filming and from what angle, which entourage member kept glancing toward the driver's seat. Which one looked suddenly unsure now that older veterans were staring him down in dead silence. His instincts were on high alert, a skill forged in steel and fire long before polished marble reflected his boots. In Afghanistan, he had learned to hear danger in tone before movement. In Syria, he had learned that crowds had tipping points and that leadership in a volatile second meant choosing the one action that preserved life and law together. 3 days after Route Bear, when the platoon was still running on numb endurance, Aaron Pike had cracked a joke over instant coffee so bitter it could strip paint. "If command ever makes me cook again," he had said, raising the tin cup in mock ceremony, "you have my written permission to report me for crimes against cuisine." Men had laughed harder than the line deserved because laughter was oxygen in that season. Corey remembered the sound now, bright and human, and it cut through the present noise with surgical clarity. Pike had been the teammate who checked everyone else first, who wrote a birthday note to a stranger's kid back home, because the father on patrol had no time. Losing him had not made Corey dramatic. It had made him exact. Brent, meanwhile, kept feeding the spectacle. He posed by the grill. He waved his followers on. He pointed at Corey like he was pointing at a mascot outside an arena gate. Entitlement radiated from him with practiced confidence. The confidence of a dealership heir who had turned money into immunity and attention into identity. His ring flashed again as he popped a can and handed it to a friend. Foam spilled down the side and dripped onto grass that covered men and women who had died in service he had never tried to understand. One entourage member finally murmured, "Man, maybe this is too much." But Brent dismissed him with a laugh and a shove of the shoulder, eyes still on his own camera. Near the rope line, the retired infantryman's message had reached its destination. He did not announce it. He simply slipped the phone back into his pocket and fixed his gaze on the truck, the set of his shoulders changing by 1 degree. enough for another veteran nearby to recognize that official consequence was already moving. No sirens yet, no lights, just the quiet certainty that institutions built on duty still had mechanisms, and those mechanisms were now engaged. The little girl in the wheelchair smoothed the corner of her folded photo with her thumb. An anxious, repetitive motion she seemed not to notice. The photo showed her father in uniform, smiling into sun, one arm around a friend just outside frame. Her eyes moved to Corey's white gloves, then to his face, searching for reassurance in a man who could not leave his discipline to offer ordinary comfort. Corey gave none outwardly, yet he adjusted one breath, deep and controlled, and set his stance through the soles of his shoes, as if anchoring not only himself, but the moral axis of the lane. The noise kept pounding, but it no longer owned the scene. The crowd's silence had changed character. It was no longer shocked paralysis. It was collective witness. People were no longer asking whether this was wrong. They were waiting for the exact second when duty, law, and courage would intersect in one visible act. Corey could feel that expectation without looking at a single face directly. He also felt the narrowing window. Brent's friend in the driver's seat revved once for the camera, a short, aggressive burst that sent exhaust into the morning and shifted the truck a few inches toward the no-vehicle memorial path. That movement crossed from disrespect into hazard. Corey's internal clock marked the transition. Protocol had one purpose: preserve the sanctity of the mission. When a threat pattern changed, the mission required response, not theater. He measured the distance again. He set the command in his mind, each word stripped to function, no excess, no anger. Around him, Arlington's white rose stood in silent formation under gathering light, and the man they had mocked as decoration prepared to remind everyone present that discipline was not fragility. It was controlled force waiting for the precise moment to act. He did not move yet. He held the line for one heartbeat longer, and in that held breath, Arlington seemed to gather itself around him. The hills rising in disciplined tiers of white markers, the humid morning pressing lightly against wool and brass, the scent of clipped grass braided now with hot engine exhaust, and a thin chemical tang from spilled beer. The truck's music still thudded, but the cemetery absorbed it without surrendering to it, as if stone and soil were reminding every living witness that noise had a short life, and memory did not. Corey's boots remained planted at regulation width, toes aligned, shoulders squared beneath a coat, tailored so precisely it sat like armor, and his face stayed unreadable, carved into the same controlled calm that had carried men through fire and carried nations through grief. By 7:34 a.m., sunlight had burned off the last low mist around Section 60, and details sharpened with almost painful clarity. The bronze vase at the Marine's marker caught a clean glint. The folded flag etched into another headstone stood out in crisp relief. Condensation ran down an open can in Brent's hand and dripped onto sacred grass in bright, careless beads. A father with construction dust still on his work pants stepped between his teenage son and the truck, not to hide him from danger, but to hold him in witness. Near the rope line, the nurse in scrubs, her badge clipped to a wrinkled cardigan, hospital shoes still damp from dawn pavement, shifted 1 foot closer to the mother with the wheelchair and asked quietly, "Do you need water?" The mother shook her head, eyes never leaving the truck. "I need this to stop." The nurse nodded once. "It will." A pair of brothers in ball caps stood with hats pressed against their chests, shoulders nearly touching, their expressions hard with old loss. 2 high school students who had earlier tried to map Corey's turns now stood rigid and silent, phones down, absorbing a civic lesson no lecture could deliver. An elderly veteran with weathered hands and a Korea campaign pin clenched his jaw and whispered to no one in particular, "Not here." His wife tightened her grip on his forearm and answered in a voice that carried farther than she intended. "He sees it. Let him do his job." Their faith in that sentence was not sentimental. It was earned over decades of watching disciplined men carry burdens civilians barely understood. The retired infantryman near the lane, the one who had sent the alert text, kept his posture neutral, but his eyes alert, scanning for the first sign of approaching authority. He did not speak. Yet another old sergeant beside him read the set of his shoulders and knew a chain of consequence was already in motion. Across the paved seam, one of Brent's own friends in a jersey, 2 sizes too large, stopped smiling and lowered his phone. "Brent, man," he muttered, voice suddenly smaller. "This isn't a lot." Brent waved him off with a dismissive flick. "Relax, it's content." The friend looked at the nearest rows of markers and swallowed. "Those are graves." Brent laughed without looking. "They're in the background." Corey tracked every exchange without turning his head. External stillness. Internal calculus. His eyes remained fixed as protocol required, but his situational map updated with each syllable and movement. The friend beginning to peel away from the core aggressor, the driver with both hands still too close to the wheel, the mother and child inside the potential arc, if the truck surged. The veterans nearest to emotional intervention. The exact number of paces to close distance if breach became mandatory. His white gloves were motionless at his sides, seams immaculate, fingertips aligned with trouser stripe. The ribbons on his chest sat in perfect rows, each one a ledger entry of sacrifice and service, and above the pocket the Tomb Guard badge rested like a small metal vow. The uniform mattered here in ways Brent could not read. The kepi's angle measured before sunrise. The coat collar checked against regulation, down to fractions. The brass polished until it reflected sky and headstone and face alike. The shoes, black and mirror bright, carrying a man who had spent years training muscles and mind to obey command over instinct. Nothing about Corey's appearance was decorative. It was ritual precision built to honor unknown names, a deliberate discipline that told mourners the ground was protected, and told the fallen they had not been forgotten. He looked to the casual eye like a static symbol. In truth, he was a living perimeter. The little girl in the wheelchair held her folded photo against her chest and watched him with solemn concentration. She was no longer looking at Brent. She was looking at Corey's stillness, trying to understand how a person could remain so composed when everything around him was wrong. Her mother knelt and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Eyes on me," she whispered. The girl shook her head. "I want to watch him." Her voice trembled only at the end. The mother followed her gaze and nodded, tears bright but contained. Then we watched together. A few feet away, the nurse drew a quiet breath and stood ready, hands open at her sides. The cemetery's soundscape narrowed and intensified. Speaker bass, idling engine, a distant bird call, a can rolling once and settling, the soft, involuntary rustle of a crowd holding itself still. In that layered audio, Corey heard the one thing most civilians missed: rhythm change. The truck's idle lifted half a notch. The steering wheel shifted. A shoe scraped the accelerator. He marked it, then marked his own breathing to override adrenaline. 4 count in, 4 count hold, 4 count out, a combat pattern repurposed for sacred ground. He could feel pulse in his jaw scar, where old tissue tightened before action. The thin line along his left cheek catching sunlight like a pale stitch of memory. That scar had started in Afghanistan. First deployment, Kunar Province, where mountain roads offered beauty and threat in the same frame. He had been 24 and hard as cable, running convoy security through villages where children waved with one hand and pointed with the other. On one patrol, a mortar team bracketed the road just beyond a market square. The second round hit a concrete awning, drove masonry outward, and turned dust into a blinding wall. Corey remembered the crack of impact, then the strange mute second afterward, when ears rang and mouths moved without sound. Shrapnel grazed his jaw, hot and fast, and blood ran into his collar, while he pulled two civilians from collapsed storefront beams and dragged them behind an armored wheel well. He did not feel pain until the evac bird lifted. He returned for a second Afghanistan tour because his unit rotated back and because leaving others to carry a burden alone was not a language he spoke. That deployment taught him patience in danger, the long grind of roads that looked harmless until they did not, the discipline of scanning rooftops while listening to local elders, the way fear could masquerade as bravado in young soldiers on their first week outside the wire. He learned to make himself useful in every small way, checking straps twice, sharing water without ceremony, writing clear reports at 0200, while others slept sitting up. Aaron Pike was there through all of it, loud when morale dipped, serious when decisions counted, a man who could fix a radio with tape and stubbornness and then crack a grin at dawn. Syria came later, leaner teams, tighter missions, more urban uncertainty. The market incident that earned Corey the Bronze Star happened in late summer under a white sky that turned concrete into glare. Indirect fire walked in from the east, 3 impacts in less than a minute. The first struck open pavement, the second clipped a support column, and the third pancaked a section of roof over produce stalls crowded with families. Corey and his squad moved through dust and shouted directions into confusion, lifting fractured timber, creating lanes, triaging with hands and pressure and command voice. He carried a boy with a broken arm to a casualty point, then went back for an older woman pinned beneath rebar. He kept going until the medic grabbed his sleeve and said, "Reyes, enough. You're bleeding again." Corey looked down, saw his old jawline reopened by flying concrete, and answered, "Not yet." What no one in Brent's entourage could have guessed was that these memories were not cinematic for Corey. They were weight. They lived in him as obligations, not stories. He remembered the smell of pulverized concrete in Syria, the same way he remembered the smell of cut grass at Arlington now. He remembered the look in a civilian father's eyes when his daughter was pulled from rubble breathing, and he recognized that same raw fear in the mother kneeling by the wheelchair today. Duty linked those moments across years and continents. Protect the vulnerable, preserve order, do not yield moral ground to chaos, and never confuse ceremony with weakness. Aaron Pike remained the center of that private map. In quieter hours, Corey still heard his friend's voice from a chow tent in Kandahar, tray half fallen, grin intact. "If I ever cook, remind me war crimes are illegal." Men had laughed, shoulders shaking, because Pike delivered humor like field medicine. Quick, necessary, unpretentious. But Corey also remembered Pike on serious nights, cleaning carbon from his rifle in silence, then looking up to check whether the newest private had eaten. "You don't get extra points for suffering quietly," Pike had told him once, tossing over an energy bar. "Eat, stay sharp. Bring everybody home?" Weeks later, en route Bear, the blast took Pike before anyone could finish a sentence. Corey carried that unfinished sentence into every duty since. When he applied for the old guard, interviews and evaluations probed precision, composure, endurance, memory. Corey passed each standard, but the true threshold was inward. Could he stand for hours in ceremonial silence without reducing the duty to performance? Could he treat unknown soldiers not as abstraction, but as brothers still in formation? Could he accept that the highest expression of strength might be restraint? He answered by action. Night after night, he trained cadence until muscle and intention were one line. He learned uniforms as a grammar of respect, each thread and fold speaking on behalf of those who could no longer speak. He accepted that the tomb asked for perfection not to glorify the guard, but to dignify the guarded. A month into his assignment, before dawn under winter rain, an older sentinel had found him repolishing already bright brass and said, "You can't shine grief out of metal, Reyes." Corey had paused, cloth in hand. The older man continued, gentler, "You can carry it right, though." Corey never forgot that. Carry it right. On this morning, facing a man who treated graves like backdrop, carrying it right meant mastering fury, waiting for legal necessity, and choosing the exact second where intervention served both safety and sanctity. The temptation to move early was real. So was the temptation to punish disrespect for its own sake. He rejected both. This duty was bigger than his anger. Around him, the crowd seemed to sense the deep current without knowing its source. A college student with a backpack whispered, "Why isn't he shouting?" The retired infantryman answered, eyes still on Corey, "Because he doesn't need to." A veteran nurse from another row, silver hair pinned beneath a cap, murmured to the students, "Watch his hands. Watch his feet. That's control." Brent's speaker blared another fight song hook, garish and loud, but now it sounded thin against the moral gravity gathering in the lane. Even Brent's followers, sensing momentum shift, glanced away from their screens toward the soldier they had mocked. The truck revved again, a harder burst this time, and rolled a fraction forward toward the no-vehicle memorial path. Corey felt the threshold close. Internally, decision clicked into place with the same certainty as a bolt locking home. His breathing settled. His shoulders remained level. His gaze stayed fixed one final beat as he prepared to convert stillness into command, to protect the grieving child, the gathered veterans, and the sanctity of every white marker on that slope with one measured act worthy of the men who never got to come home. He locked that decision behind his eyes and held position, while the man in the jersey kept performing as if sacred ground were a parking lot he owned. Brent Halverson was broad through the chest, sunburned at the neck, and wrapped in team colors loud enough to announce his loyalty before he spoke. A diamond-studded championship ring flashed on his hand each time he pointed at a camera, and every gesture carried the practiced swagger of someone raised inside insulated privilege. His father's name sat on 3 dealership billboards across Northern Virginia. His own name sat on a sports podcast banner, and his weekend identity had become a branded spectacle. Extreme away game tailgates, film for followers who rewarded noise, excess, and defiance with ad revenue and applause. He wore that reputation like armor. Here, among white markers and folded flags, it looked like costume. One of the high school boys near the rope line whispered, "That's Halverson. He did that rooftop grill stunt in Dallas." Teacher shot him a hard glance, not for recognition, but for tone, and the boy lowered his voice to a hush. Another visitor, a middle-aged man in a Navy veteran cap, muttered, "He thinks this is content." No one answered. They watched Brent slam the truck door with his hip, snatch a set of tongs from the tailgate, and jab them in Corey's direction like a baton. "You hearing me, parade boy?" he called. "You stand there, we'll stand here. We'll stand. Everybody wins." Laughter came from 2 men behind him, thinner now, less certain than before. The disrespect had layers, and Corey registered each one without flinching. Open cans stood on graveside grass in bright aluminum rows. A charcoal bag had been dragged across a paved seam lined with memorial flowers, leaving black dust where mourners had knelt minutes earlier. A portable speaker was balanced against a sign marking restricted vehicle access, bass pulses rattling the post in short, violent beats. Brent's cameraman walked backward between headstones to frame a wider shot and nearly clipped a bronze vase before a woman in memorial black hissed, "Watch your step," with enough force to stop him cold. He apologized to no one, just adjusted his angle, and kept filming. By 7:35 a.m., the humidity had risen into a thin sheen on foreheads and collarbones, and the smell of hot engine metal pressed harder into the scent of cut grass and roses left at nearby graves. Brent leaned into that atmosphere like a man feeding on resistance. He popped another can, sprayed foam in a celebratory arc, then spread both arms to the camera. "Historic Tailgate takeover," he announced. "Most exclusive lot in America." The line drew a few uneasy laughs from his own crew and a low, collective sound from the crowd that was not quite a gasp and not quite a groan, but carried the same moral recoil as hearing a joke at a funeral. Corey did not grant him eye contact. He held his lane with ceremonial precision, but the tactical map behind that stillness grew sharper each second. Brent's driver had slid back into the seat and kept one hand draped across the top of the steering wheel. Another entourage member, heavyset and jittery, scanned faces in the crowd with the look of a man realizing too late that public attention can turn from entertainment to condemnation in a single minute. The cameraman shifted closer to Corey's arc, trying to capture a reaction that never came. That was Brent's fatal assumption, made visible in real time. He believed silence meant weakness, and uniform meant decoration. He strutted 3 paces forward, boots crushing a patch of decorative gravel near a family marker, and raised his voice again. "You're not a cop. You're a statue with a dress code." He tapped his ring against a can and smirked toward his lens. "This guy is a prop. Tell me I'm wrong." The comments feed on his phone lit his face with flickering light. He grinned wider, mistaking digital noise for authority. Behind him, one of his friends finally spoke up at normal volume. "Brent, man, seriously, cut it out." Brent answered without looking back. "Then get out of frame." The crowd's composition now felt like a cross-section of the country forced into one moral test. A retired command sergeant major stood with his cane planted like a stake, jaw rigid, eyes fixed on the truck. 2 teenage girls in school hoodies clutched notebooks to their chests and watched with stunned, dry-eyed disbelief. A father in work gloves set his palm on his son's shoulder and kept it there, not restraining him, anchoring him. The mother by the wheelchair had both hands on her daughter's handles, and the little girl held her folded photo against her cardigan, gaze locked on Corey as if he were the only stable object in a world suddenly swaying. Across that witness line, Corey's body remained the image of regulated calm. Inside, every system was primed. He cataloged Brent's distance at just under 12 yards. The truck's bumper angle canted toward the no-vehicle memorial path, the speaker cord snaking across grass where a panicked bystander could trip. The nearest elderly visitor within 3 long strides of potential vehicle movement. He ran command language in sequence, clipped and lawful. He evaluated hand placement, line of sight, crowd egress lanes. The training from convoy routes and urban collapse zones translated cleanly. Isolate the primary disruptor, control motion, protect civilians, preserve mission integrity. A soft vibration buzzed from the retired infantryman's pocket. He checked the screen once, then moved 2 steps to the veteran in the Navy cap and spoke under his breath. "They're inbound." The Navy veteran gave one tight nod and passed nothing further. But the message traveled anyway by posture, alone. Shoulders squared, chins lifted, eyes returned to Corey. External contact had become consequence in motion, quiet and professional, the way institutions worked when people inside them still remembered what duty required. Seconds stretched until sound seemed to separate into strands. The speaker's drumline thump became distinct from the engine idle. A can rolled and ticked against concrete with tiny metallic clicks. Someone near the back whispered a prayer. Someone else whispered, "Please." The little girl in the wheelchair raised her folded photo half an inch higher, as if presenting her father to the scene. Corey saw that movement in peripheral vision and felt the old pressure in his chest where grief and command lived side by side. Aaron Pike's memory sat there too, not as distraction, as directive. Carry it right. Brent moved first again because men built on ego could not tolerate stillness they did not control. He snapped his fingers at the driver. "Ease it up, just to the path. Better shot." The driver hesitated, then gave the accelerator a short press. The truck lurched 6 inches, stopped, lurched again, front tire kissing the edge of the memorial path where no civilian vehicle belonged. A woman in the crowd cried out, "No!" The heavyset friend stepped backward, hands up. "I'm out," he said, voice shaking, and retreated toward the curb. Brent ignored him, eyes still on the phone mounted to his stabilizer. Corey's pulse remained steady. He shifted his weight by a fraction, through the soles of his shoes, the kind of micro-adjustment no untrained eye would catch. Calves loaded, shoulders stayed level, jaw unclenched and set. He felt his left scar tighten with readiness, felt the white glove seams against his fingers, felt the line of his coat settle over muscle, gone taut beneath the wool. To the crowd he still looked carved from marble, but inside him every instinct was firing in disciplined harmony, not rage, not panic, but controlled force held on a short tether. "Last warning, toy soldier," Brent shouted, emboldened by his own echo. "Move or get moved." He took one more step toward Corey's lane, close enough now that his cologne cut through diesel and grass. The ring flashed again. The camera lens pointed directly into Corey's chest ribbons, as if trying to reduce earned history to background texture. Corey gave him nothing. No flinch, no glance, no reaction Brent could monetize. The silence around that non-response hit harder than any shouted rebuttal. Even Brent's remaining supporters stopped cheering. Another 10 seconds passed, then 20. In that deliberate stretch, the cemetery seemed to reclaim acoustic command from the speaker. Wind through low trees, distant flag halyard tapping metal, a bird lifting from a hedge. Corey marked all of it, while his internal clock tracked the likely arrival window of Arlington National Cemetery Police and Colonel Whitaker's office response. He did not need to see flashing lights yet. He needed one lawful, defensible threshold. The truck gave it to him when the front wheel climbed fully onto the memorial path and crushed the edge of a flower arrangement left at a nearby headstone. The mother by the wheelchair pulled her daughter back by inches. The command sergeant major's cane struck a pavement once, hard. 2 veterans started forward and stopped themselves at the same instant, trusting the soldier in blues to act at the exact point duty demanded. Corey felt the collective inhale of the crowd, that unified suspension between outrage and action, and he stepped deeper into stillness for one final beat, gathering every lesson from war, ceremony, and loss into a single, controlled intention. When he moved, it would be one step, one command, and one line no one on that hillside would ever mistake again. Corey moved. It was one step, Nothing more. But the entire hillside felt it like a fault line shifting under stone. His right shoe left its mark on the ceremonial lane and came down on the edge of the memorial path with controlled force, heel then sole, a precise transfer of weight that turned disciplined stillness into command. The motion was clean, economical, and absolute. White glove rising, shoulders squared, chin level. To the crowd, it looked like time had slowed itself to watch. The speaker kept thudding for half a second after he stepped. Then Brent's driver jerked his hand off the accelerator as if the sound itself had slapped him. Corey's raised palm faced the truck, fingers aligned, not shaking, a signal older than argument and stronger than noise. His voice cut across diesel, drums, and muttered panic in one steel straight line. This is hallowed ground, not your stadium. Engine off, hands visible, and stand down now. No shout, no profanity, no extra word to feed a camera. Just command. Brent froze mid-breath, stabilizer still lifted, grin collapsing by degrees into a hard, blank stare. The ring on his hand flashed once and then seemed suddenly cheap against the white geometry of graves behind him. His mouth opened like he meant to answer with another insult, but nothing came out. The driver, eyes wide, killed the engine so fast the key rattled in the ignition. A fan belt whine faded. The speaker stuttered into silence as one of Brent's friends yanked the all cable free with fumbling fingers. In the sudden quiet, a single can tipped from the tailgate, struck metal, and rolled in a long metallic whisper until it settled against the curb. The crowd exhaled all at once. Gasps, some in awe, others furious, moved through the rope line in a low wave. The mother by the wheelchair pressed a hand to her chest and closed her eyes for one beat before opening them again. The little girl kept her gaze on Corey, folded photo held high against her cardigan, and her breathing slowed as if she had been waiting for permission to believe the world still had order. Two veterans who had been holding themselves in check lowered their shoulders, but did not move forward. The retired command sergeant major with the cane gave one sharp nod, the kind senior NCOs reserved for clean execution under pressure. Brent recovered enough to sneer, but his voice cracked around the edges. "You can't talk to me like that. You're just—" Corey did not lower his hand. Hands visible. The words landed harder than the first line. Brent's free hand came up by reflex. The driver lifted both palms to the windshield. Behind them, the heavy-set friend who had tried to leave backed farther away and muttered, "I told you, man," to no one willing to answer. Another entourage member set his phone down at his side, camera still rolling but pointed at the ground, as if he understood that every second now belonged to federal record, not social media content. 30 seconds stretched with courtroom wait. By the time they ended, flashing lights cut across the lower lane beyond Section 60. Blue and amber reflections strobed over marble and chrome. Arlington National Cemetery police units came in tight and controlled. No sirens, tires whispering over pavement, officers stepping out with practiced economy. Their postures said the same thing Corey's step had said. This ground had rules, and those rules had teeth. Two officers approached the truck in a measured wedge while a third moved to secure the grill and open containers as evidence, photographing placement before touching anything. A fourth officer turned to the crowd and in a calm professional tone asked witnesses to remain available for statements. Colonel Nathan Whitaker arrived less than a minute behind the first unit in a government SUV, dress uniform immaculate despite the heat rising off the grass. He was broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, and carried command authority the way some men carried rank insignia. Not loud, but impossible to miss. He took in the scene in one scan. Truck on restricted path. Crushed flowers, open cans, crowd composition, Corey's position, and his jaw set like a lock. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. "Who is in charge of this vehicle?" Brent turned toward him with a half-formed smile, trying to reassemble bravado from fragments. "Colonel, right?" "Great. You can tell your guy to back off. We were leaving anyway." Whitaker's eyes did not blink. "Name?" "Brent Halverson." "Mr. Halverson, you are on federal cemetery grounds in violation of posted restrictions and direct lawful command. You will remain where you are." The sentence ended whatever was left of Brent's performance. For the first time that morning, he looked not at his phone, not at his friends, but at the rows of white headstones as if seeing them clearly for the first time, and realizing none of them cared who his father was. One officer read him the preliminary violations in clipped sequence: trespass in restricted area, open container on federal property, disorderly conduct, destruction of memorial property associated with grave adornment. Another officer documented the crushed flower arrangement and tagged the cans where they lay. The cameraman tried to edge backward. An officer stopped him with a flat palm and directed him to provide his device for evidence extraction, pending warrant process. He complied without protest. By 7:39 a.m., the sun had climbed high enough to throw short shadows from every marker, and the scene had shifted from chaos to procedure. That change, more than any shouted confrontation could have, humbled Brent in front of everyone he had tried to impress. He attempted one final appeal, voice thinner now. "This is overkill. It was a prank." Whitaker stepped closer, each word measured. "Men and women are buried here. Families mourn here. There are no pranks in this cemetery." Silence answered him. Even Brent's closest friends stared at the grass. The retired infantryman who had sent the first text gave a statement to an officer, then pointed out the exact timeline. Horn, barrier breach, unloading, verbal taunts, wheel movement onto memorial path, command issued, compliance. The command sergeant major confirmed the sequence and provided his own note that he had relayed location and threat details through official channels the instant escalation began. The nurse in scrubs identified the position of the wheelchair and child relative to the vehicle's path. Her voice steady, clinical, precise. The high school teachers submitted student footage showing Brent's entourage stepping between headstones to film. Every external contact paid forward and to document consequence. Physical evidence stacked quickly and cleanly. The open cans were photographed, bagged, and logged. The charcoal bag and portable grill were seized pending disposition. Officers marked the tire imprint, where it had climbed the memorial path edge, and photographed the crushed flowers with the scale indicators. A grounds supervisor was called to assess and restore the damaged arrangement, noting replacement cost for restitution filing. The posted restricted access sign, rattled loose by the speaker but not broken, was documented and secured. No item floated unresolved. Each was either entered, returned, or scheduled for repair under record. Brent was not handcuffed in dramatic fashion. He did not need to be. Humiliation had already done its work. He was escorted to a patrol vehicle, read next steps, and informed that pending magistrate review, he would be issued citations and an immediate exclusion order from Arlington National Cemetery grounds. His shoulders, so broad with swagger an hour earlier, had folded inward by inches. As he passed the rope line, nobody jeered. The crowd's silence was sterner than ridicule. The little boy in the red windbreaker from earlier watched him go with solemn eyes and asked his father, softly, "Did the soldier win?" His father kept his gaze on Corey and answered, "Duty did." Whitaker turned then to Corey, who had resumed a neutral stance the moment officers took operational control. Sweat traced lightly along Corey's collar line in the growing heat, but his posture remained exact, glove seams aligned, gaze steady. The colonel gave him a direct look that carried both professional assessment and private respect. "Staff Sergeant Reyes, report." Corey delivered it in concise military cadence. No embellishment, no emotion spilled into language. Observed breach, assessed hazard, issued lawful command at threshold, maintained control until cemetery police arrival, no civilian injuries, scene transferred to responding authority. Whitaker listened without interruption and nodded once. "Your judgment was correct. Your restraint was exemplary." He paused, letting the words carry to the crowd as much as to the soldier. "You protected the living and the fallen. Resume your duty when released by responding officers." "Yes, sir." That was all. An officer approached Corey for a formal witness notation, obtained his statement, confirmed body camera timestamp correlation with civilian footage, and released him back to ceremonial authority. The process took minutes, but each minute mattered because institutions were strongest when they were meticulous. By the second week of that hot Virginia month, people would remember the line Corey spoke, but professionals in uniform would also remember that evidence had been logged correctly, witnesses handled respectfully, and sacred ground restored through law rather than spectacle. As Brent's truck was towed from the restricted lane, its oversized tires left faint tracks on dust that grounds crews would erase before noon. The grill and cooler went into evidence transport. The entourage dispersed in subdued clusters, most without meeting anyone's eyes. One young man, the same friend who had warned Brent to stop, quietly handed an officer his full recording and said, "Use all of it." The officer thanked him and noted chain of custody. Loaded setup resolved. No loose thread left to rumor. The mother by the wheelchair bent to her daughter's level. "You okay?" she whispered. The girl looked at Corey, then at her father's headstone, then back again. "He stood up for Dad," she said. Her mother's throat tightened. "He stood up for all of them." Corey heard none of that directly, and yet he felt the weight of it, in the way the crowd looked at him now, not as spectacle, not as prop, but as what he had always been. A sentinel carrying a vow in public view. He gave no speech. He sought no acknowledgement. When the final officer stepped clear and the lane was his again, he reset his stance on the stone with microscopic precision, turned on Mark, and prepared to place the next step exactly where duty required. His next step landed on stone with the same measured authority as the first one that morning, and the lane seemed to exhale around it. He moved through the turn exactly on Mark, rifle steady, shoulders level, white gloves immaculate despite heat and exhaust and the human chaos that had just been pushed back by law. The crowd did not clap. No one cheered. They watched in a silence that had matured from shock into reverence, the kind of silence that understood what it had seen and refused to cheapen it with noise. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. The rhythm returned like a heartbeat, restored after an arrhythmia. The speaker was gone. The truck was gone. Officers still worked the perimeter near Section 60, but their movements were now procedural rather than urgent, and that distinction mattered. A ground supervisor in a Greene County vehicle knelt by the crushed arrangement and rebuilt it stem by stem, replacing bent flowers with fresh ones from a chilled carrier. An evidence tech photographed the restored marker, logged completion, and read the item numbers aloud to a second officer who confirmed each one against the incident sheet. Cans bagged, grill tagged, cooler impounded, video devices documented, sign resecured, tire mark images uploaded, witness statements attached. Every object that had violated the ground now belonged to a record built for consequence. At 7:52 a.m., an Arlington National Cemetery police sergeant walked to the retired infantryman, a command sergeant major in retirement, and handed him a small card with an incident number and direct follow-up contact. "Your report was timely and accurate," he said. "Dispatch got your location pin from the text and your call to operations within 90 seconds. That closed our response window fast." The retired infantryman nodded once and tucked the card into his wallet behind an old photo. He tapped his cane to the pavement and answered, "That sentinel did the hard part." The sergeant glanced toward Corey's march and said, "He did exactly what this place requires." Near the rope line, the high school teacher gathered her students without breaking the hush. She held up one hand, fingers spread, and spoke quietly. "Phones away. Not because you're in trouble, because you're going to remember this with your own eyes." One boy who had recognized Brent earlier swallowed and asked, "Is that what discipline looks like?" She looked at Corey's turn, then back at him. "That's what duty looks like when nobody can buy their way around it." The nurse in scrubs, still beside the mother and child, gave a faint nod at that sentence and finally took the water bottle she had been holding uncapped for 15 minutes and drank. Corey remained in cadence, but his awareness kept sweeping the field in disciplined arcs. The cameraman's seized phone was now in an evidence pouch. The jittery friend who had backed away had given his statement and left on foot, shoulders hunched, eyes down. The friend who had whispered that this was too much had stayed long enough to sign a witness form, then stood alone at the curb as if trying to decide what loyalty meant when stripped of spectacle. He never looked at Corey, and he never returned to the truck's path. The loaded looks from Brent's entourage paid off in plain daylight. Uncertainty had won over bravado, and two of them asked officers how to submit full video copies voluntarily before departure. They were told where to send them, and they did. By 8:10 a.m., Colonel Whitaker stood with the cemetery operations captain and reviewed the preliminary actions in low voices that carried military precision. "Exclusion order, effective immediately," the captain said. "Federal citations filed before noon. Magistrate appearance scheduled." Whitaker's reply was clipped and final. "Ensure restitution for the damaged arrangement post by close of business. No exceptions." He paused, then added, "And the apology condition?" The captain answered, "Recorded statement before release from processing, on file and attached to the case package." Whitaker gave one nod, looked once more toward Corey's lane, and stepped away to let ritual reclaim the center. The apology was recorded in a small administrative room with beige walls, a fixed camera, and no audience to flatter. Brent sat at a steel table without sunglasses, jersey wrinkled, voice stripped of swagger. An officer placed the terms in front of him and said, "Read it clearly." Brent stared at the page for a long second, then read, "He had entered restricted cemetery grounds without authorization, interfered with mourners, and disrespected a federal military burial site." He acknowledged he was barred from Arlington National Cemetery and subject to arrest if he returned without written clearance. He apologized to families present and to service members interred there. The officer stopped the recording, logged the file, and printed receipt copies. Brent signed with a hand that no longer performed for a camera. On the lane, none of that administrative language altered Corey's pace. Duty was not fed by vindication. It was fed by repetition done right. The little girl in the wheelchair watched him through 3 full cycles, folded photo still in both hands, then looked up at her mother. "Can I do it now?" she whispered. Her mother's eyes were red but steady. "Yes, baby." The girl lifted her right hand carefully to her brow, fingers trembling at first, and then settling into a small, earnest salute directed toward her father's headstone and beyond it toward the sentinel who had held the line. Corey reached the end of his count, halted, and turned. As he came back through her line of sight, he did not break cadence, did not step out of protocol, did not offer theater. He gave the smallest nod permitted by duty, almost imperceptible unless you were the one waiting for it. The girl saw it. Her shoulders loosened. She lowered her salute with deliberate care and pressed the folded photo to her chest again. The mother covered her mouth with one hand, breathing through tears she had contained all morning. The nurse beside them looked away toward the headstones to give them privacy, then quietly rolled the wheelchair a few inches closer to the grave so mother and daughter could rest there in peace. A veteran with weathered hands, the one who had whispered "not here," removed his cap and held it against his heart as Corey passed. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," he said under his breath, not expecting a response and receiving none. The words were not ignored. They were absorbed into the same silent ledger where Corey carried Pike's name, and 100 unnamed obligations. 2 rows over, the brothers in ball caps stood shoulder to shoulder again. One finally finished the sentence he had stopped earlier in the morning. "My uncle would have liked him." The other answered, eyes on the march, "Your uncle would have trusted him." By late afternoon, the humidity had broken, and a cooler breeze moved through Arlington's trees, lifting the edge of flags and carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass back over marble. Corey completed his assigned lane rotation, submitted final supplementary notes to his chain as required, and reset his uniform for evening duty with the same meticulous attention he gave every mission. Brass rechecked, gloves changed, shoes repolished until they reflected light like still water. Procedure closed cleanly around the incident. Evidence was in custody. Reports were filed. Witness contacts were logged. Damaged flowers had been replaced and documented. The rattled restricted access sign stood straight again. At sunset, he returned to the tomb. The plaza held that particular evening light that turns white stone into gold at the edges and blue in the seams. Rows of headstones rolled into the distance like a formation at rest. Visitors gathered along the boundary in respectful quiet. Families with children standing still, elderly couples with veteran pins, students now wordless, workers in root shoes and construction boots, strangers shaped into community by what they had witnessed. Corey took his post, with his face an unreadable mask of discipline, eyes fixed on a point only he could see, and began again. His boots clicked in perfect rhythm. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. In that measured cadence, the day's noise fell away completely. There was no trace of diesel, no shout, no ring flash, no camera hunger left on the stone. There was only marble, flag, twilight, and a sentinel carrying the weight of something bigger than himself with unflinching precision. The little girl and her mother stood at a respectful distance before leaving the cemetery, and just before they turned down the path, the girl lifted one final salute toward the tomb. Corey completed his pause, turned on Mark, and continued his march as the light faded over Arlington. Sacred ground restored and held.